Wyoming Territory, 1879. The wind carried her laugh across the empty prairie, wild and bright, and it stopped him in his tracks. Elias Sutton had been riding west since dawn, dust in his eyes, his horse twitching with fatigue beneath him. He had not expected to find anything out here, just a quiet stretch of land between Cheyenne and a mining town no one remembered the name of. But there it was again. A laugh. Light, unguarded. A woman's voice, drifting through the grass like sunlight. He turned his horse toward it without thinking. The land opened up around him, and then he saw her. Sitting cross-legged beside a tipped-over wagon, her skirts dusty, her hair a mess of chestnut curls, and her head thrown back in laughter as a small boy no older than 5 waved a stick like a sword in front of her. Elias reined in a few yards away, unsure. The boy froze. The woman stood slowly, shielding the boy behind her, her eyes wary but steady. "I am not here to cause trouble," Elias said, lifting both hands. "Just heard someone laughing like the world had not ended and thought maybe I had gone mad." She tilted her head, studying him. "World has not ended," she said. "Not yet, anyway." He nodded toward the wagon. "You stranded?" The boy peeked around her skirts. Elias offered him a small smile. "My axle cracked yesterday," she said. "Been trying to fix it but I am not much of a carpenter." He dismounted. "You alone out here?" She hesitated, then said, "Just me and my son." Elias looked at the boy, who had stepped forward now, still holding his stick like a sword. "What is your name, partner?" "Bennet," the boy said proudly. "I am Elias," he said, crouching to meet Bennet's eyes. "That is a fine sword you have." Bennet grinned wider. "It is a dragon sword." Elias looked up at the woman. "And you?" "Rowena Vance." Her voice was calm, but there was something tired in her eyes. "Exhaustion, maybe. Or something older." Elias stood and nodded once. "Let me take a look at your axle." She hesitated again, then gave a small nod. He spent the next hour beneath the wagon, sleeves rolled, hands black with grease and grit. The axle was cracked clean through. No way she could have known how to fix it. He would need to brace it with wood, maybe metal if he had any in his saddlebag. He worked in silence, the sun beating down, while Rowena and Bennet sat nearby. Every so often, Bennet would ask if he needed help, offering small stones or twigs. Elias accepted them all with a grateful nod. When he finally stood, wiping sweat from his brow, he said, "I can patch it enough to get you to the nearest town. That is about 9 miles east. But you should not be out here alone." Rowena crossed her arms. "I am not helpless." "I did not say you were." She looked away, jaw tight. Elias stepped closer. "What happened to your wagon train?" She was quiet for a long moment, then said, "I left it. Too many men thinking a woman alone with a child was theirs to command. I waited too long to leave. But I left." Elias nodded. "You did the right thing." Rowena blinked, surprised. Most men would have told her she was foolish. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "Anywhere that does not ask questions." Elias looked at the sun, then back at her. "Let us get this wagon moving. You can decide where you are going once you are safe." She hesitated again, then nodded. They traveled slow, the patched axle groaning under the weight. Elias rode beside the wagon, keeping one eye on the road, the other on Rowena and Bennet. The boy chattered most of the way, asking Elias if he had ever fought a real dragon, if his horse had a name, if he could ride it someday. Elias answered every question with a steady patience that surprised even him. They reached the town of Halston Bend by nightfall. It was little more than a few buildings and a livery stable, but it had a blacksmith and a boarding house. Elias helped Rowena down from the wagon, then lifted Bennet into her arms. "Stay at the boarding house," he said. "I will bring the axle to the blacksmith in the morning." She looked at him, her eyes softening. "Why are you helping us?" Elias paused. He could have said it was the right thing to do. He could have said she reminded him of someone. But the truth was simpler. "I heard you laugh," he said. "And I wanted to hear it again." That made her smile. Not a big one. Just enough. That night, Elias sat on the porch of the boarding house, watching the stars while Bennet slept inside and Rowena mended a tear in her dress. She looked up once, caught him watching her, and gave a small nod. Not quite an invitation, but not a dismissal either. He stayed. The next day, he brought the blacksmith to the wagon. They worked through the afternoon, replacing the axle, tightening the wheels, reinforcing the undercarriage. Rowena brought them water, her skirts brushing the dust, her hands rough but graceful. Bennet watched from the porch, sword in hand. When the wagon was fixed, Elias turned to her. "You could keep going," he said. "Or you could stay." Rowena looked around. The town was small, but quiet. No one asked questions. No one stared too long. "Stay where?" "There is a cabin," Elias said. "About 4 miles out. Empty since the widow passed last winter. Need some cleaning, but it is yours if you want it." Rowena looked at Bennet, who was chasing a butterfly across the porch. Then she looked at Elias. "Why are you doing this?" He met her gaze. "Because I want to." She did not speak for a long moment. Then she said, "All right." They moved into the cabin that week. Elias helped patch the roof, hauled in firewood, and rode into town for supplies. Rowena scrubbed the floors, taught Bennet his letters by lantern light, and set flowers in an old jar on the table. Elias stayed in the lean-to beside the barn, saying nothing about the cold. Every morning, Bennet ran out to wake him, dragging him inside for breakfast. Every night, Rowena left the door unlatched. She still laughed sometimes. Not often. But when she did, it was always out of nowhere while feeding the chickens, or washing clothes, or chasing Bennet through the meadow. And every time, Elias looked up. Every time, he smiled. One afternoon, 2 weeks after they had settled in, Rowena found Elias fixing a fence post near the cornfield. She stood watching him for a moment, the wind tugging at her hair. "You always work this hard?" she asked. He straightened, wiping his hands. "Only when someone is watching." Rowena stepped closer. "I am not used to people staying." "I am not going anywhere," Elias said. She looked up at him, her eyes clear. "I believe you." And then she kissed him. It was not planned. It was not dramatic. Just a quiet moment, her hand on his chest, his arms wrapping around her like he had been waiting his whole life to do so. The prairie stretched wide around them, the wind soft through the grass. When they pulled apart, she was smiling. "You heard me laugh," she said. "And you followed it." He nodded. "Straight to my future." By the time the first frost came, the cabin had taken on the shape of a home. The sagging porch had been straightened, the chimney repaired with stones from the creek. Smoke curled from it now most mornings, thin and steady. A half-cured deer hide hung beside the door, and the fields behind the barn showed neat rows of winter vegetables: turnips, cabbage, parsnips. Rowena had started those with Elias's help, though she confessed she'd never planted a thing in her life she didn't expect to lose. "I was raised in rooms with curtains," she said one evening, peeling potatoes at the table, her sleeves rolled high on her arms. "Mama said dirt had no place under a lady's nails." Elias glanced over from the hearth where he was boiling down tallow. "Do you miss it?" She considered that, her hands pausing. "Sometimes I miss being clean. But I don't miss being told to stay still." The days had gotten shorter. Bennet, forever in motion, had taken to building forts out of firewood and pretending the chickens were spies. He trailed Elias through chores, asking questions about how to recognize a storm coming, what wolves sound like, and why the stars never fall, even when you wish on them. One night after Bennet had fallen asleep under a quilt stitched with crooked stars, Rowena sat on the porch steps with Elias, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. The moonlight caught the edge of her cheekbone, stark and pale. "You were in the war," she said quietly. Elias didn't answer at first. The wind sifted through the dry grass. Insects rasped low in the cold. "I didn't fire a rifle until the second year," he said. "They had me running messages. Then they didn't." Rowena turned her head slightly. "Did you lose someone?" He didn't look away from the dark. "2 brothers. One by bullet. One by fever. Buried both myself." A long silence passed. "I lost my husband to whiskey," she said. "Not all at once. Little by little. He stopped seeing us. Then he stopped coming home. When he did, I stopped being gentle." Elias turned his head, met her eyes. "You don't owe me reasons." "I know," she said. "But I want you to know them anyway." He reached over, warm fingers brushing against hers. She didn't pull away. The air smelled of smoke and damp wood. Somewhere beyond the barn, an owl called low. Later that week, Rowena walked into town with Bennet while Elias stayed behind to mend a broken gate latch. She returned with a parcel of fabric and a jar of preserved peaches, cheeks red from the wind, Bennet asleep in her arms. "Found a woman who crochets lace," she said once Elias had taken the boy from her and tucked him into bed. "She said she could make curtains if I bring her measurements." Elias leaned on the doorframe, arms crossed. "I thought you didn't care for curtains." Rowena smiled faintly. "I care about light coming through something soft." He stepped closer. "You think this place needs softening?" "I think I do," she said. Elias reached out and touched a stray curl at her temple, brushing it behind her ear. "You're stronger than anyone I've met." "That's not the same as being soft," she murmured. He leaned down and kissed her, slow and certain, with the kind of care that came after months of building something wordless between them. She leaned into it, her hands finding the front of his shirt and holding there. That night, he didn't return to the lean-to. He stayed, curled beside her under a quilt of crooked stars, one arm around her waist, her breath steady against his chest. In the weeks that followed, the rhythms of their life settled deep. Elias hunted farther north as the game began to thin, sometimes gone from dawn to dusk. Rowena patched his coat with thick thread when the seams gave out and taught Bennet to read from the Bible she kept tucked inside a flour tin. They rarely spoke of what had come before. There was too much now, too much pressing and real. One afternoon in early December, Rowena stood at the window with a cup of chicory, watching the snow begin to fall in slow, heavy flakes. "I used to be afraid of silence," she said as Elias came in, boots stamped with snow. "Now I listen for it." He set his rifle by the door, shrugged off his coat. "What do you hear?" She looked at him. "Us. In the quiet." He crossed to her, pulled her close. "I never thought I'd fit into anything again," he said. "Not after everything." "You don't fit," she said, voice low. "You belong." He rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed. "Then I'm home." Rowena's hand slid up to his face, her thumb brushing the edge of his jaw. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of every morning they'd woken to the same light, every meal passed hand to hand, every fire tended together. Outside, the snow thickened. Inside, the warmth held. The snow deepened in the following weeks, settling into drifts along the fence rows and burying the last of the garden beds. The world grew quieter, the sounds of life muffled beneath thick white. Inside the cabin, the fire never died, and neither did the rhythm they'd come to know, measured, steady, intimate in its quietness. One morning, Rowena stood at the basin washing her hair, her sleeves damp and her skin flushed from the heat of boiled water. Elias came in from the barn with a cut on his hand, just shallow enough to sting. Caught it on a rusted nail. Gate latch snapped when I leaned on it. She dried her hands on her apron and pulled the tin of salve from the shelf. You'll need to soak that. If it festers, you'll be no use to anyone. I didn't say it was nothing, he said with a faint rasp, letting her guide him to a chair. Just didn't want to track in blood before breakfast. She knelt, brushing his fingers clean with a cloth, her expression focused. Next time, call me out. You were humming. Thought maybe you were somewhere else. Rowena didn't look up. I was. But I can come back. He watched her work, the press of her thumb gentle as she wrapped the wound. Where do you go when you hum like that? She tied off the bandage and sat back on her heels. To a place I don't remember clearly. Just a feeling. Sun through lace curtains. My mother's voice reading out loud. Elias touched her chin, coaxing her eyes to his. You hum different now. Rowena's brow furrowed. How so? Like you're here. She stood and turned away, busying herself with the kettle. I never meant to stay this long. And yet, you haven't mentioned leaving. I suppose I haven't. That night, while Bennet slept curled beneath a sheepskin blanket, Elias found her outside with a bundle of dried herbs in her hands, shaking snow from them before she brought them in to hang. He watched the way her shoulders moved, how her hips shifted beneath her wool skirt as she worked. You always dry oregano in the cold? He asked, his breath puffing into the night. The cold kills the mold, she answered. And I like the smell. Reminds me I can make something last. He stood beside her, close enough to feel the heat of her body. You've made this last, he said. She didn't move. It's not mine alone. Elias reached for her hand, drawing it into his coat. You don't have to keep testing if you're allowed to stay. Rowena let out a breath. I've never known a man who didn't expect something back. I do expect something, he said, voice low. I expect to share this life with you. The silence stretched between them, long and unhurried. Then she stepped closer, resting her forehead against his chest. Then I hope you like wild onions and rough quilts, she whispered. I like whatever grows beside you. By mid-January, Bennet had begun carving animals from scrap wood, a habit Elias encouraged with small tools and praise doled out in gruff, quiet ways. One morning, Bennet handed Rowena a crude carving of a bird with one wing shorter than the other. It's not perfect, he said, eyes downcast. Rowena ran her fingers over it. It's strong enough to fly. Elias said nothing, but later that evening, he added a small shelf above the hearth. The bird sat there now, watching over their evenings. The first time Rowena laid her sewing aside to pick up Elias's journal, he watched her without comment. She skimmed the pages, her brow drawing tight at times, smoothing at others. You write about things you don't say. I write to understand them. She closed the book gently. I think I'd like to try that. Elias handed her a blank ledger from the drawer. Start with today. She did. At first only a few lines, written in the late hours after Bennet had gone to sleep. Then more. Her pen scratched softly while Elias carved by lamplight, the two of them working in companionable silence. One evening, she looked up from her page and said, You ever think about what comes next? Elias didn't answer right away. He set his knife down, eyes meeting hers. I think about spring. About planting. I think about Bennet running through tall grass. I think about you in bare feet, carrying a pail of water from the creek. Rowena tilted her head. That's not what I meant. I know, he said. But I think about that, too. I think about asking you to marry me. Her lips parted, then closed again. She looked down at her hands, then back at him. I've never had a proposal that didn't feel like a trap. This one's a gate, he said. You can walk through it if you want, or lean on it a while and think. She stood, crossed the space between them, and laid her hand on his cheek. I've leaned on worse things, she said. And none of them held me. Elias pulled her close, his hands steady at her back. Outside, the snow had paused, hanging in the still air like a held breath. Inside, the fire crackled, and the bird on the shelf cast a crooked shadow. She looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. Then yes. His smile was quiet, but it reached all the way through him. The thaw came slow that year. Not in a rush of meltwater or sudden green, but in quiet signs, the brittle crust of snow softening underfoot, the creek whispering again beneath its ice, the hens laying more often. In the mornings, Rowena opened the door and stood for a long moment, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup, watching the light change. It warmed the edge of the porch now, reached farther into the trees. She didn't say anything about it, but Elias saw the shift in her shoulders. Less braced. Less waiting. One Thursday, Elias rode into Halston Bend to trade a cured fox pelt for seed potatoes and kerosene. He returned with more than he bargained for, a letter addressed to Mrs. Rowena Vance, the writing thin and careful, with a postmark from St. Louis. She read it twice at the table, lips pressed tight, then folded it and slid it between the pages of her ledger. Bennet, busy whittling a flat piece of pine into what he claimed would be a cow, glanced up but said nothing. Elias waited until the boy had gone outside before speaking. Bad news? He died last autumn, she said flatly. A cousin wrote. Found him in a tenement stairwell. Nothing in his pockets but a pawn stub and a cracked pipe. Elias nodded once. He knew better than to offer pity. I thought I'd feel. I don't know, she said. Something. You don't owe him grief. I don't owe him anything, she said, standing. But I do owe myself some truth. She spent the afternoon repairing the porch rail, driving nails with more force than needed. Elias joined her without a word, and when the last piece was in place, she sat down hard on the top step. I used to think if I just held out long enough, he'd come back different, she said. Elias sank down beside her. And now? I don't think about him at all most days. That has to count for something. It counts for everything. That evening, she left the ledger open on the table while she cooked. Elias glanced at the page just once and saw her handwriting, sharper than usual. No names. Just a single line, I am not the same woman who left Missouri. Spring teased its way into April. Bennet grew broader in the shoulders, his legs longer, his questions more pointed. Are you gonna marry my ma or not? He asked Elias one morning while helping feed the goats. Elias didn't flinch. I already asked her. She said yes. Then when? When the ground's soft enough to not snap the shovel. Bennet's grin was wide and gap-toothed. You're gonna build her something, aren't you? Thinking about a porch swing. She'd like that. Elias bent to check a loose hitch on the gate. She'd like you being this helpful even more. They married under a cottonwood beside the creek in late April. No preacher. Just a binding of hands and vows spoken plain. Rowena wore the green dress she'd mended through the winter, and Elias had borrowed a clean shirt from the general store's dry goods barrel. Bennet stood between them, holding the ring Elias had carved from a strip of horn and polished until it gleamed. I never wanted someone to rescue me, Rowena said, voice steady. I never thought I could belong, Elias said. They didn't kiss until Bennet yelled, aren't you supposed to do that now? They laughed, Rowena first, bright and full, and then Elias leaned in, slow like always, and met her mouth with his. Later, after the sun dipped behind the ridge and the evening cooled, Rowena sat with Elias on the new swing he'd hung just that morning. The movement was gentle, the creak of the chain familiar already. I used to dream about finding peace, she said. And I never thought it would look like this. A swing. A boy chasing fireflies. A man who listens more than he speaks. Elias reached down and brushed a thumb over her knuckles. I never dreamed at all. Not until you. She rested her head on his shoulder, the skin of her cheek warm despite the breeze. "I'm glad you followed my laugh," she said. "I'd follow it again, every time." "No need," she murmured. "You're already here." And he was. The garden rose darkened with fresh earth as May lengthened into June, and the days stretched under a steady sun. Elias drove stakes between the rows of beams while Rowena pruned the young apple tree near the fence. Bennet kept to the shade, fletching twigs with goose feathers and string Elias had traded for in town. The boy hummed tunelessly, legs swinging from the edge of the wagon bed, his hands quick and sure. Rowena shaded her eyes. "He's less restless lately." Elias didn't look up. "He's learning what it is to stay." She watched Bennet for a moment longer. "He's never had a rhythm this long without it breaking." "You've given him that," Elias said. Rowena moved to the well, working the lever until water splashed into the bucket below. "We gave it," she said, voice quiet. "Together." That evening, they ate on the porch, the wind warm but not dry, the scent of crushed mint rising from where Rowena had planted it near the steps. Elias passed her a slice of cornbread, and she broke it in half, handing the larger piece to Bennet without a word. "I started a letter today," she said after a while. Elias pushed his plate aside. "To who?" "To myself," she said. "To who I was last year." He waited. "I wanted her to know she did the right thing. That it didn't all come apart." He nodded. "She'd believe you?" "She wouldn't recognize herself." They sat in silence, the kind that didn't need filling. When Bennet wandered off to check the chicken roost, Elias leaned forward. "You ever think about adding to the family?" Rowena blinked. "You mean more children?" He nodded once. "Only if you wanted." She studied his face for a long moment. "I never let myself imagine that before." "You can now." She looked toward the barn, where Bennet had just let out a shout of triumph, holding up a fresh egg. "I might like that," she said. "Seeing a child grow up knowing what steady love looks like." Elias reached for her hand, his fingers calloused and warm. "Then we'll make room." They spent the summer slowly, mornings full of chores, afternoons spent under the cottonwood, sharing stories neither had told before. Elias spoke once of a creek in Tennessee where he'd hidden for 2 days during the war, not from the enemy, but from the weight of what he'd seen. Rowena told him of a night she'd climbed her childhood roof just to see the stars without bars on the windows. Bennet built a wind chime from shells and wire, and hung it from the cabin's eave. It clattered softly whenever the breeze picked up. Rowena said it sounded like the sea, though she'd never seen it. In August, Rowena missed her courses. She told Elias that evening, her voice steady but uncertain. He took her hands in both of his. "You're not alone in this." "I know," she said. But I still needed to say it out loud. They didn't speak of names, not yet. Instead, they built a cradle from pine planks, planed smooth and left unpainted. Bennet painted a small bird on the side, the same shape as the one that still sat above the hearth. When the baby came in the first week of March, Rowena labored through the night. Elias never left her side, his hand in hers, calm and unwavering. Bennet stayed with the neighbor woman down the road, his face pale with worry, but his feet steady when Elias came for him at dawn. "She's here," Elias said, voice thick with awe. "And she's loud." Bennet ran the whole way back. Rowena rested in the bed, her hair damp, the child wrapped tightly against her chest. She looked up when Bennet entered, and lifted the edge of the blanket. "Meet your sister," she whispered. The boy approached slowly, then laid a careful finger on the baby's curled fist. "She's got your nose," he said. "She's got her own," Rowena answered, smiling. Elias stood behind them, one hand on Bennet's shoulder, the other resting on the bed frame. The morning light filtered through the homespun curtains, soft and golden. That spring, the orchard bloomed early. Rowena walked among the blossoms with the baby strapped close to her chest, her steps sure even after a long winter indoors. Elias repaired the barn roof with Bennet's help, the boy now tall enough to reach the lower beams. Days passed in quiet work and shared laughter, in the hum of bees and the smell of warm earth. One evening, Rowena sat at the table writing again, her brow furrowed in concentration. Elias held the baby, rocking her gently with one arm while carving a new spoon from a length of cedar. Rowena looked up. "I think I'm ready to write her a name." He didn't ask who she meant. She closed the ledger and set her pen down. "Her name is Clara." Elias nodded. "Strong name." "And kind," Rowena said. "Like her family." That night, as the wind rustled the trees and the chime tinkled faintly above the porch, Rowena lay curled against Elias, Clara breathing softly in her cradle nearby. "I didn't know life could feel like this," she whispered. "Like what?" "Like it's still going," she said. "Still opening." Elias pressed a kiss to her forehead. "We keep walking through the gate," he said. "Every day." Outside, the moon cast silver across their land, fields they had sown together, a home they had built from grit and grace. They never left it. Not because they couldn't, but because they had no reason to. And so they stayed, Rowena, Elias, Bennet, and Clara, growing older, growing together. Through seasons thick with green and lean with snow, through laughter and quiet, through the long, sweet shape of a life well earned. Not perfect, but whole. And theirs.